Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and we thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Our guest today, Dr. Richard Gallagher, is a well-known psychiatrist, author, and professor who has spent his career studying the intersection of psychology, spirituality, and the supernatural. Born in New York City in 1950, Dr. Gallagher earned his undergraduate degree from Princeton University before attending medical school at Yale. He completed his residency in psychiatry at the New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center and has been practicing medicine for over 3 decades. Throughout his career, Dr. Gallagher has been a strong advocate for the integration of spiritual and religious practices into mental health treatment. His work has been published in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including the American Journal of Psychiatry and the Journal of Religion and Health. In addition to his clinical work, Dr. Gallagher is also a respected academic. He currently holds faculty positions at multiple prestigious institutions, including the New York Medical College and the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. One area of Dr. Gallagher's expertise that has garnered significant attention is his work with demonic possession and exorcism. Despite the often skeptical view of the medical community towards claims of possession, Dr. Gallagher considers each case with an open mind and a scientific approach. He works closely with religious leaders and exorcists to provide compassionate care to those who believe they are under the influence of malevolent spirits. Dr. Gallagher's unique perspective on possession is informed by his deep knowledge of both medicine and spirituality, and in particular, Catholicism. He has evaluated and treated many individuals who claim to be possessed by evil entities, and has served as a consultant on numerous high-profile cases of alleged possession. In this capacity, as the consultant for exorcists, Dr. Gallagher has undoubtedly seen more cases of possession, many quite disturbing, than any other physician in the world. He has also written extensively on the topic, including his recent book entitled Demonic Foes: My 25 Years as a Psychiatrist Investigating Possessions, Diabolic Attacks, and the Paranormal. Our interview with him is next. But before we get to that, it is March break in Ontario, and we hope that you and your friends and family are making plans for the week. You will include us and join us on a paranormal adventure. We do have ghost tours running every night in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, and we would love to have you out to share some great ghost stories and get some fresh air. Don't forget, as a Haunted Talks listener, you can use the promo code Haunted Talks, all one word, Haunted Talks at checkout to get 15% off all your ghost tour tickets. If you live outside Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto and want to get in on the spooky fun, we do have online experiences for you to try, including our Haunting at Home, which challenges you to complete experiments with the paranormal in your own home, and our virtual haunted campfires, which bring together some of the best ghost storytellers in the world. For information on our ghost tours and virtual experiences, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk. And please be sure to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you listen to us. Dr. Richard Gallagher, welcome to Haunted Talks.
Thank you, Mr. Dean.
Your appearance on the show comes at a very auspicious time. Just 2 episodes ago, we spoke with a hospital chaplain in Winnipeg, Manitoba, who recently has written his PhD dissertation, inspired by his experiences and those of his healthcare colleagues, which calls for more training for those in the church to conduct and carry out exorcisms. Last year at this time, we spoke to Dr. Irving Finkel from the British Museum, who outlined how the earliest moments of recorded human history show in Mesopotamia that the belief in demons was extremely commonplace and just part of day-to-day life. I see your appearance here as the final installment of this trilogy. We've heard from a historian, we have heard from a member of the clergy, and now yourself, a psychiatrist. How did you, a self-described man of science, come to believe in the existence of demons?
Well, the short answer is I was overwhelmed by the evidence once I'd been asked to get involved in this field. And pretty much, Mr. Dean, everything I've been asked to do, I didn't particularly volunteer for. I had finished my residency in psychiatry at Yale, and I was working for a medical college called Cornell. And one afternoon, this rumpled-looking, erudite-seeming priest knocked on my door and said, "Dr. Gallagher, I've heard you're a Catholic psychiatrist, a Catholic and a psychiatrist, and I have some odd cases, including one in particular that I'd like to send you, which I think are demonic." And I said to him, this was a time, Mr. Dean, when there was what we call the satanic panic going on, where people were seeing Satanists everywhere. There were people who alleged that in America, 50,000 kids had been kidnapped by Satanists, which is more than the amount of children who were disappeared. And most of those people were runaways. So I was quite skeptical of all these reports. And I said that to the priest, and he said to me with a smirk, somewhat to my surprise, he said, "Well, Dr. Gallagher, then you're the perfect man for the job," because he wanted a man of science. And of course, as a physician, I have to be a man of science. He wanted a scientifically trained doctor to come into these cases that he was going to ask me to evaluate with a certain amount of skepticism. And the rest sort of happened over the years. More people sent me cases. I eventually got invited to join, and I'm the longest standing member of the International Association of Exorcists, which is approved by the Vatican. I was later asked to write articles and appear on TV shows, write a book, and believe it or not, in the relatively near future, even Hollywood has come knocking and asked me to get involved in a movie. So this all sort of happened, I'd like to think, providentially.
Now, you make clear in the book, these cases you're involved with, these are not your patients. You're acting in more of a consulting role. Is that right? And how long have you been consulting then on these types of cases?
You're exactly right, and thank you for mentioning that. These are not my patients. In the book, I had their permission to write about them, but I disguised their identity. All the facts are exactly accurate, but I changed the names and sort of the locales. But these are not my patients. I'm not an exorcist. I'm a doctor who does consultations. And by this point, I've done consultations actually all over the world, because of things like Zoom and, simply the telephone. I've consulted probably on more of these cases than any physician in the world. As my former chairman, who was a Catholic believer, by the way, also wrote in the forward to my book. And given modern communications, Mr. Dean, I've probably seen more of these cases of possessions and other types of demonic attacks than any physician in history. That's my guess.
I think a lot of us have difficulty conceptualizing what a demon is. Could you shed some light on that from us? What are demons? Where do they come from? And what is their purpose for interacting with human beings?
Well, we talked a little bit before we started the recording. You were mentioning that from the earliest period of human history in Mesopotamia, cultures have always believed in evil spirits. Now they've had a lot of sometimes misconceptions and sometimes inaccuracies about how they conceptualize it. Sometimes exaggerations. Seeing evil spirits when it was either people's imaginations or some type of medical or psychiatric illness. But the fact of the matter is that human cultures pretty universally have believed in evil spirits. Now, different religions have slightly different ideas about who these evil spirits could be. Some people think they're dead souls. In ancient times, sometimes they were regarded as quasi deities who sometimes could act maliciously. And various religions have believed in intermediate spirits. It was interesting that later in pre-Christian history, the Jewish thinkers of the time, in my opinion, astutely, began to recognize that these reports of paranormal activity by deities and that sort of thing were in fact caused by demons. And the belief began to coalesce around the idea that these were fallen angels. Now, of course, when Jesus of Nazareth came, that's what he clearly taught, that these were fallen angels. I would say that the major Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, early Judaism, as well as Islam, have come to the conclusion that these are fallen angels who have rebelled against God. And obviously, it's a very traditional belief, and it's a belief that I agree with. In part, I agree with because I've been to many exorcisms. Again, I'm not an exorcist, but I've been to many exorcisms. And it's a good sign when the priest exorcist, as usually is the case, there are other religions that do exorcisms too, but I'm most familiar with Catholic priest exorcists. And when they pin the entity who is possessing the individual down, reluctantly, after a time period when the evil spirit has lied about who they are. I had one guy who said to me, "Do you want to speak to Zeus?" I said, "Not particularly," because he felt Zeus, believe it or not, was possessing him. Again, a smart guy, not a psychotic guy. And other people have said, Judas Iscariot or Hitler or Nero or some kind of deceased soul like Uncle Jimmy, who was, a nefarious guy, is now possessing them. But interestingly, to me, and I think to most sensible religious students, the demons eventually are forced to admit that they are evil spirits who have rebelled against God, and they often name themselves. Some people get worked up about, naming themselves, but what really occurs when a demon is forced against their will, because for millennia they've hidden, they're forced against their will to reveal themselves. And that's a good sign, because what it shows is that the demon is being compelled, we Christians would believe by our Lord. It's not the exorcist, it's our Lord who ultimately forces them to reveal the truth about themselves. And they admit that they are demons. A real quick story about a woman who was not possessed, but was feeling what we call oppressed by spirits. Again, perfectly sane. She had already been evaluated by a number of psychiatrists who couldn't explain the case, but told me that she seemed a perfectly sane person. So originally she comes to me, Mr. Dean, and she says, angels are talking to me. And I said, and what's the purpose? They say they have a great mission for me. I read about this in the book. And she says, I don't believe it because, I'm not this wonderful saintly person or anything. I said, well, you're probably onto something. I understand it's a weird experience. Why don't you work with this priest and pray about it and see what happens? So she came back to me a month later and she said, yes, they've revealed who they are. They're dead souls. Now, that's the bread and butter, as you probably know, of spiritualists who think they're in contact with dead souls. And I said, well, what do you think of that idea? She said, well, I know in the Bible, which is true in the Hebrew Bible, especially Deuteronomy and Leviticus, communing with dead souls is regarded as an abomination. And she was a salt of the earth, sort of religious, very down to earth person. I said, well, keep praying and see what happens. And then eventually she came to me and she said, I think you suspected this, Dr. Gallagher, but you were right. They have finally admitted, as I work with the priest, that they're demons, that they're evil spirits. I find that a very interesting and telling story. To get back to your question, I have a very traditional belief. I think that these evil spirits, these spirits that possess people, are demons, and they kind of admit in rare circumstances that they have rebelled against God, and they're in their own place, such as it is. Probably not a happy place, but we don't know too much about it.
Is the demonic agenda really an agenda against God in the sense of doing something that would upset or anger the deity? Or is it a want to inflict pain upon people or some combination of the two?
It's a combination of the two. I mean, ultimately, they hate God because now they have been excluded from, divine beatitude, and they've excluded themselves. I mean, that's their free choice. They made a free choice. It's often taught in Catholic theology that God doesn't force himself on people. So people can rebel against God. Now, they also hate human beings in part because human beings can still turn to God. Human beings, certainly the figure of what we believe is the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ was a human being. So they also hate human beings as well as the Son of God. They hate human beings as sort of their indirect way of attacking God. They can't really attack God. God is all powerful and much more able to deal in his providential ways with evil spirits. But they can attack vulnerable human beings, and they do. And they regard us as sort of their inferiors. I often tell the story. In fact, I told the story in the book. They're actually going to make a movie out of this woman. They disguise her identity. She was a Satanist. I saw her in a possessed trance once, and the demon was speaking through her. And I was actually driving in a car with the priest, and she addressed the priest, not me. And she said to the priest, leave her alone, you monkey priest. And I always thought that sort of is how demons think of human beings. They think of us as these crude animals, little better than monkeys. I tell people, as a man of science, I do believe in evolution. I believe that's the way God arranged it, even though that's a belief that a lot of people find difficult to accept. But I say, I'm pretty darn sure that these demons saw evolution happening, and they think of us as just evolved monkeys.
You mentioned a part of the book that really captured my imagination, and that's when you referred to how, demons have been trying to hide themselves for millennia, which prompted me to think about the question, well, how many demons are there? What is the scale of this problem. And I'm sure that's an unanswerable question in many ways, but what is your sense after, 25 years of working these cases? Is it much more common than we would think?
Well, I think possession itself is rare. And anybody who's diagnosing possessions all over the place is making a mistake. I mean, fundamentalists can do that, and they can even take, common mental illnesses like schizophrenics who think they're hearing demonic voices and say, "Oh, that must be a possession." So possessions are rare. What we call other attacks short of possession, what we call oppressions, at least in the book, people use different terminology. They're a little more common. This is where people get harassed but not possessed by evil spirits. They're a little more common than possessions, but they're still rare. Now, most Christians, as I'm sure you're well aware, as well as Muslims and some traditional Jewish believers, do believe that everybody is in some ways tempted by demons. Although it's also important not to act like that absolves people of human responsibility. We have free will, and we can't jump to the conclusion that demons are causing all sinful or evil behavior. I mean, the great, in some ways, semi official theologian Thomas Aquinas used to say that 90% of human evil is caused by simply human behavior. Again, these estimates, how many there are, how often they tempt people, as you used the word, are unanswerable questions. But there's no doubt in my mind that the most common strategy of demons is to tempt people. I actually agree with C.S. Lewis, however, that on the one hand, we shouldn't act like demons don't exist. It's always good to know your enemy. On the other hand, we shouldn't exaggerate their influence either or act like they can override free will. They can't.
Who is most likely to suffer from a demonic infestation? Do you find similarities in the histories of the folks who were victims to these kinds of attacks?
You're using a particular term, infestations, which actually we use usually. We also think of as another sort of demonic attack upon a place. But I know what you're really talking about possession. And possessions most often happen in people who have turned to the dark side. They may have turned to very evil behavior. They may have turned to occultism or sort of dark practices, sometimes Satanists. There are Satanists. I think there are fewer than the crazies think there are. And even in America nowadays, we have all kinds of conspiracy theories floating around the media about satanic cannibals and all that. So it's a topic that gets a little exaggerated in an hysterical way. But having said that, people occasionally do turn to dark beliefs and practices. The woman I write most prominently in the book is this Satanist. I call her by the pseudonym Julia, and she was an out and out Satanist. And she was, she was pleasant enough to me. She was an intelligent woman. I think she was grateful for my attempting to help her, but she was kind of a nasty person. That's a classic example of someone who might get possessed. I also write about a drug lord in the book who was possessed that I came to know very well. He was a criminal, and he was a very successful criminal for a while. He credited his success as a criminal and drug dealer, sort of a drug lord in some ways, to his practice of Santa Muerte, which is a Mexican sort of dark cult, a kind of blasphemous play on, devotion to saints. He did very well as a criminal until he didn't, until he got arrested and he was in prison. You mentioned to me about a hospital chaplain who does exorcisms. Well, this was a different man, but the chaplain in the prison diagnosed him as possessed. Now, eventually, he did turn back to the church. He was brought up Catholic, and he got delivered.
I found it surprising in the book you mentioned that another target of these attacks is kind of the exact opposite. Those who have a particularly strong faith or have gone through some type of positive transformation in their own lives as well. I wonder if you could speak about what that phenomena is like.
You have to make a subtle distinction there because those people, holy people, and there have been many reports of very saintly people who have experienced some kind of demonic harassment. I would call it a type of minor oppression, but the terminology differs. They're not generally possessed. They are harassed by spirits because they're sort of building up our Lord's kingdom, we would say, and so they become particular targets. Most of those people deal with their harassment very differently, with a certain amount of equanimity and offering up their sufferings, but they don't tend to be possessed.
In the book you mention, people ask you to describe what is an exorcism like, and you make the point that they're all different, which I think is understandable and a case-by-case basis. But for those of us who have never been in the room when one of these is occurring, are there some guideposts or some similarities that you can share with us to try to give us some sense of what's happening?
Well, there are commonalities, especially in the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox tradition, because they have a set of prayers that they tend to, in the Catholic Church, that they're required for an official exorcism, which is not that common. So the priest is going to say those prayers, basically, Psalms, gospel passages, praying for deliverance. But what I emphasize in the book that I think you're picking up on, Mr. Dean, is that exorcists are going to have their own style and personality, even if they use the same prayers. Demons have their own personalities too. So, to the extent that there's a little bit of back and forth between the demon and the priest, you're going to have differences as well. There's also differences in the sense that I've seen exorcisms that have delivered a person in one session, and I've seen other exorcisms that go on for years. On the one hand, there's a certain amount of commonalities. On the other hand, exorcisms can differ depending on the case, depending on the priest, depending on the actions of the demon.
Has there been a moment in one of these exorcisms you've attended that you found particularly striking, or something that kind of shook your confidence in pursuing this area of study?
I think when I first got involved in the field, there were some creepy enough cases that I was so struck that I said to myself, what are you getting into here? For instance, the Satanist case was a good example because I didn't go to any of her exorcisms, but the priest was talking to me once on the phone. Why don't you come to this exorcism? And, I'm a family man. I was a busy academic psychiatrist, so I didn't really have the time to go to this exorcism, which was not right in my area. And the voice that I had heard, which called the priest a monkey priest, very similar. I mean, using the vocal cords of the woman, of course, didn't sound disembodied. As I was talking on a landline, this wasn't a cell phone, with the priest, that same voice came in over the telephone line, saying basically the same thing. We told you to leave her alone. And, I'm sitting there in my house saying, what have I got myself into? That even on my own phone line, the demons can manifest themselves. Another incident, actually, when I first met this woman, I was in the bedroom upstairs of my house with my wife, and our cats went berserk. I tell this story in the book, too. You may remember it. We had to separate them. We didn't know what to make of it. The very next morning, I was introduced to her, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Nice to meet you, Dr. Gallagher. By the way, how'd you like the cats last night?" That's an experience that gives you a little bit of pause. But again, I've seen so much, Mr. Dean, over the years. I've seen demons speaking foreign languages. I've seen demons do all kinds of weird things that I'm a little nonplussed by it now.
You mentioned in the book that often, unlike the movies, which of course take liberties with all sorts of things, but usually one exorcism doesn't seem to do the job. It's more like a almost a medication that you have to take. Is that a fair assessment? And I guess my overall question is, what is the success rate of an exorcism or a course of exorcisms been from your perspective?
As I mentioned earlier, I mean, I have seen exorcisms which have delivered the person from an evil spirit in one session, but that is the exception that proves the rule. The basic reason why exorcisms often take a little bit of time, I mean, it's ultimately up to our Lord, of course. In the Gospels, Jesus delivers people very quickly, but he's our Lord. In most cases, there is a internal battle going on as well in the person. They have to turn and reform their life. I mentioned about that drug lord who had a successful exorcism. Now, he really worked at returning to the faith, going to church, praying every day, and he was delivered eventually. On the other hand, the Satanist woman, she refused basically to do what the priest advised her, that she had to leave the cult and reform her life. In part, she didn't want to give up certain psychic powers that she had. She had what the parapsychologists called remote viewing. She could see people at a distance. She felt that she had other psychic abilities. It's another criteria of possession called, in Latin, latra, means knowledge of hidden things. She, for instance, knew how my mother had died years earlier of ovarian cancer, but she knew how a lot of people had died. So she had all this hidden knowledge that she claimed was fed her by Satan himself. When I hear certain spiritualists and so-called occult healers, when I hear them say, "Oh, I'm gifted," I'm always reminded of her remark to me. She said, "Nobody's gifted. We get our power from below." Now, there are people who regard themselves as spiritually gifted because of gifts from God, but nobody is inherently, gifted on their own. And I think that this Satanist, Julia, was completely accurate that she didn't have any gifts on her own. One of the reasons she had such difficulty leaving the cult and giving up her worship of Satan, and she literally was a Satan worshiper, was because she thought that Satan had given her benefits. There are psychotic people who, have masochistic or delusional beliefs about demons. But this was a perfectly intelligent, sane woman who made a calculation that I'm getting enough out of my Satan worship. And it reminds me of cultures throughout history that say have dark practices like human sacrifices, like the Aztecs, like the Carthaginians. And a lot of modern people say, well, why would they do that? Well, it's for the same reason. They felt they get something out of it from demonic forces. And they probably did, although it's a literally Faustian bargain in the end.
After our recent interview with the hospital chaplain, someone responded to one of our social media posts with the comment, "These people don't need exorcisms, they need better mental health support." Setting aside that the chaplain was focused on exorcisms of spaces, not people, I think this attitude is fairly common, especially as we as a society become more understanding and aware of mental health in general. When you're consulting on one of these baffling cases, how challenging is it to determine if there is a mental health issue or some other physical ailment present versus something supernatural?
I mean, occasionally it's challenging, but, what people don't understand is that you have to have much more evidence of something. We call it preternatural, the secular world calls it paranormal. You have to have very clear evidence that a foreign spirit is present. I mean, I referred to some of the more classic signs where, people speak foreign languages they've never known. I've seen that many times where people exhibit strange movements or strength. I dealt with a woman who, she was 90 pounds soaking wet. She took a 200-pound deacon, threw him all the way across the church hall, That was not a hysteric strength or something or manic energy. I mentioned with Julia and a number of possessed people that they can reveal all these hidden knowledges. And Julia and a number of people I have talked to have even levitated, especially during their exorcisms. So I say to people, how many mentally ill people do you know who can speak or understand all these languages, who levitate, who have this hidden knowledge? And again, people come up with all kinds of, rationalizations. Well, maybe they're cold readers or they had a burst of psychotic energy. But, these signs go so far beyond it. And then especially if you have an historical context where these people have turned to occultism or turned to the dark side. I'm not saying this is going to happen to anybody. And as a matter of fact, I used to be the county crisis director in my area. I probably evaluated maybe 27,000 people in my life as a psychiatrist, and none of those people were possessed. So I'm not willy-nilly calling people with mental illness. So if you're trained to be open-minded about possession, but you're a well-trained mental health professional, you're not going to confuse the two once you know all the facts. Now, a lot of people don't always know all the facts. So they may take a case of multiple personality or histrionic dissociation or just an evil person, a sociopath, or somebody who's psychotic and delusional about being possessed. They may confuse that. That's not generally something that would confuse me, nor would it confuse, quite frankly, most well-trained, health professionals.
I'd like to get into a couple of specific passages from the book that I think speak to mine and our audience's kind of interests in the paranormal, which covers things like, the ghost stories, paranormal investigation. Just asking the big picture, what are ghosts? Are ghosts real? What is these things that people report so commonly? And the first passage you write is, along with the word paranormal, the loose term parapsychology was coined in the modern era to explain these so-called psychic phenomena and the gaps in our scientific explanations for the likes of possessions, hauntings, and ghost stories. Of course, this realm of study never advances as spiritual phenomena. These experiences can't be subjected to traditional scientific or experimental scrutiny, yet the pseudoscience of parapsychology marches on. Is it true that this realm of study, and that could be, if we expand parapsychology to maybe science in general, never advances? With your own field in recent history, our understanding of how the brain works in response to various stimuli, most notably trauma, has developed considerably. The hospital chaplain mentioned how groundbreaking work in the field of physics is showing how there are spooky elements of the natural world, such as the observer effect, or how particles can affect each other at inconceivably large distances. As a man of science, are you not concerned at all that you may be conflating that which is yet to be understood with that which cannot be?
Well, on the one hand, I'm certainly a big believer in science. As a physician, I could not operate without clinical trials and that sort of thing. Modern science, the word we use in a modern sense of the word science, is built on methodological naturalism. That's a philosophical concept, meaning we have to kind of assume there are materialistic things that we can study, we can do lab experiments on, we can replicate studies, we can do clinical trials, and that advances. These other questions that we're talking about today, I think, are unlikely to be better understood than traditional, I'll say, theologians have already understood them. There's nothing new under the sun. People throughout all cultures reported possessions. Demons have fooled people from the dawn of history of who they really are. That's not going to change. And there's always going to be people who fall for their tricks. As you quoted in the passage from the book, paranormal and parapsychological are really modern terms. They don't explain anything. What they say is look, there are these weird phenomena, there are these psychic events, we don't understand them, let's study them. Number one, a lot of these stuff you really can't study because demons are not going to subject themselves to experiments. They're smarter and more powerful than human beings. They know what's going on. You can't do an experiment on this type of thing. And these things are not just vague manifestations of energy that you can somehow study in a lab. So I'm quite skeptical that these perennial philosophical debates between materialism and supernaturalism are really going to advance in a modern scientific context. Science, the original word comes from the Latin scientia, from the Greek episteme. That's where we get the word epistemology. And science was originally meant to be knowledge. So Plato, for instance, used the word episteme, meaning knowledge. We have certain knowledge about, say, what a good man is like, or we have certain historical knowledge. Most of the evidence, pretty much all the evidence for religious phenomena and demonic activity is going to be historical. That doesn't mean it's anti-scientific. We believe that Washington crossed the Delaware River. We can't do a lab experiment on that. We either accept the evidence or not. One of the reasons I wrote the book, Mr. Dean, was because I was originally challenged after writing an article for the Washington Post to present more evidence. Well, I figured I'll give the evidence that I've accumulated over 25 years. But people don't have to just believe me. I go to a meeting. In fact, I'm going to address the Assembly of Exorcists this year in a town north of Rome, where there's 500 exorcists around the world. Now, they all have stories like mine. People just don't believe them, maybe because they're priests or they're not a doctor or something. But many of them have written books. I mean, I'll get a little religiously apologetic for a moment. I compare it to when St. Paul went to skeptics in Corinth. He preached that Jesus was risen from the dead. And he said, you don't have to believe me. There are 500 other people who saw him. And I say to people, you don't have to believe me. Talk to any of these 500 people. This is not like, talk about hidden knowledge. This is not hidden knowledge. People write books about this stuff. Everybody is challenged to believe it for themselves. I don't think that this type of field, since there's been paranormal events since the beginning of history and people have always debated what it is, I don't think that by the principles of modern science you're going to pin it down anymore. That doesn't mean that we reject science. We certainly don't. But I doubt that any novel theory about demons is all of a sudden going to shed light on this. We tend to believe that science is marching on, and science is marching on and on. We have great vaccines now, which some people reject. We have antibiotics. We have space travel and marvels of engineering. Science has made great advances. But when you're talking about more spiritual issues, it's more a matter of people are going to debate this to the end of history. The great mathematician Pascal was a great student of religious and human nature. And he said, there is evidence out there. There's plenty of evidence. And the honest seeker can evaluate that evidence. But a lot of people don't bother doing that.
The second passage I'd like to read touches on something you've mentioned a few times. You write, we also know that demons lie and can disguise themselves by assuming an astonishing variety of different forms. Why not expect they are doing the same by playing upon human fears of ghosts and the like? In any case, I clearly think the burden of proof is on anyone trying to challenge the time-honored view amongst most religious experts that the strange abilities of the demonic world are aimed at misleading and terrifying us, including through the wide variety of infestations reported throughout history. I have two questions about this particular section. When I think about our own experience researching ghost stories or paranormal reports, one very common one is a ghost that appears or somehow conveys a warning about something that is going to happen. In the most dramatic cases, that's a plane crash or some type of tragic event that is averted because of the intercession of some supernatural being. In those cases, then, how do we differentiate between that which is a demon conveying this kind of information versus something, I suppose, more godlike or from God in actually trying to do something positive in the world or for the individual having the experience?
Well, first of all, only God knows the future. So if there's an accurate prediction about the future, it may well be divine. I mean, we certainly believe in prophecies, for instance, that there's been authentic prophecies in history. Having said that, I think that stuff is very rare. But I'm not saying that, say, angels couldn't appear to somebody, but those aren't ghosts. The way we traditionally think about ghosts is creatures who terrify people or scare people or create mischief. And many people who are possessed, by the way, have phenomena of infestation in their house. You will see that they either see dark spirits or they, will have sacred items in their house defaced or broken or rosary beads scattered all over the house. Now, it's clearly something non material that is doing that. So it's clearly a spirit, and it's a harmful spirit. And, if words have any meaning, Mr. Dean, harmful spirits are evil spirits. And sometimes it's just people's imagination, obviously, or misperceptions. But spirits that are harmful scare people. We talked before about, why do demons attack human beings? And they probably attack human beings not only because it's their indirect way of attacking God, but because, like a sadist, they get some pleasure out of it. It's like lording it over a dog or something. Some sick people get some kind of sadistic pleasure out of it. I would compare demons to that. And so, if something spiritual, if something non material is attacking or scaring or harming a person, that's an evil spirit of some sort, however you conceptualize it. Now, there are people who think that, deceased souls who come from hell or something, could possibly appear to people. I mean, those are debates. I have an open mind about that, but I've never been convinced that anybody has hard evidence that that's the case because I do know that evil spirits pretend to be deceased souls so much in possessions that I'm unlikely to give them much credence, whatever any kind of evil spirit would communicate.
It's interesting, and we're involved with paranormal investigations, and one of the interesting phenomena we've noted is that when investigating a historical site, for example, that has a backstory of, violence or executions, those kinds of things, what we found is quite extraordinary is that when people start, spend some time in these places, conduct these parapsychological experiments, what often comes through, or they report coming through, are relatives that who have passed. These experiences are always, almost always, extremely positive and reinforcing. I wonder how those play out in this scenario too, where it seems just some reassurance kind of comes through, which doesn't seem to be evil or demonic in that sense, but it does seem like something is happening. We're noting that when people just have some intention of connecting with the larger spiritual world, very positive messages seem to come through as well.
Well, look, people can debate these things. I just think one has to be very careful in those situations that people unwittingly aren't being drawn into a realm that is confusing. So, for instance, in some ways, you're talking about spiritualism, which again is very strongly condemned in the Bible. And I think the reason it's condemned is because people get preoccupied with these things They don't really know the forces that they're dealing with. Of course, any realm that's going to try to manifest to human beings, like a good spy or something, is going to try to ingratiate themselves to some extent. And when people tell me, and people have, I had a woman who came to me, and she claimed that she had gone to a fortune teller, and the fortune teller told her that she was in touch with spirits, gave her very reassuring messages about relatives who passed and allegedly were in some happier place. And then the fortune teller told her, "Oh, by the way, it's also revealed to me that you'll never get married." I mean, the woman was devastated. I said to her, I said, "Well, even though you're getting this knowledge that has seemed to you benign, it could be intermingled with a message aimed to demoralize you at the same time. It could be a kind of demonic trick if you want." And I said, "You don't have to believe that at all." I said, nobody knows the future except God." She was very reassured, and within a year she was married. So people get these messages that sometimes are very revealing. They say, "Well, Uncle Jimmy talked about when he took me to Central Park and stuff. And, it was a beautiful experience." But sometimes those messages draw people into a realm that is not healthy, number one, that is illusionary, number two, because that wasn't really Uncle Jimmy. And number three, eventually have a certain bite to it that comes back to deliver some kind of eventual message that is confusing. I mean, it could also just be spirits playing with people, because they seem to, again, regard us as so inferior intelligent as to just want to play with our belief systems. And there are many people who have been drawn to spiritualism, which is really what we're talking about here, who have abandoned traditional beliefs. As again, the Bible warns against people, which was called necromancy or summoning spirits. It's very strongly condemned. I tend to think that people who get preoccupied with that sort of stuff often pay a price. I mentioned, I think before we were on air, this Catholic friend of mine named Adam Bly, who writes a lot about this sort of thing. And he tells me that many of these paranormal investigators eventually come to him because they have unfortunate things happen to them. Even on the Exorcist movie, a lot of the original Exorcist was a very successful movie based on a real case, although fictionalized in the book. A lot of very dark things happened. Fire broke out, and some people had tragedies. So this is not a realm for the faint-hearted, and I think people. I mean, to the extent that I'm giving a warning without being superstitious about it, one needs to be careful when one gets involved in investigating this stuff. You may be investigating something that come back to bite you, sort of curiosity killed the cat type of thing.
The book is Demonic Foes, My 25 Years as a Psychiatrist Investigating Possessions, Diabolic Attacks, and the Paranormal. Dr. Richard Gallagher, it's been fantastic to have you with us today. Is there any final word you would like to leave with our audience as we say goodbye?
Well, again, I mean, I'm not here to scare people. I'm not here to think, somebody's just going to wake up and get possessed. It's good to try to lead a healthy, I would say, spiritual life, and try to be a good person, and then you don't really have to worry about this stuff. On the other hand, I have enough experience in this field, Mr. Dean, that in some ways I was challenged by people. Okay, Gallagher, put up or shut up. Tell us about the evidence. And as I said, perhaps as a scientifically trained physician and a very experienced psychiatrist, there was some value in my speaking out. But I don't mean to imply that I'm the only one who writes about this stuff. First of all, I know other psychiatrists who believe exactly the way I do. Number two, people can read all kinds of other people who have written about this stuff in a coherent way. Some people say to me, "Well, how does it feel to be out of the mainstream?" And I always say to them, "What mainstream are you talking about?" at least in the United States, most people believe in evil spirits. Around the world, most people believe in evil spirits. In fact, a country where you wouldn't necessarily think about it, my book was translated into Japanese and several other languages. I mean, in East Asia, there is almost universal beliefs in evil spirits, at least, very prevalent. And throughout history, as we talked about, the vast majority of humans have believed in evil spirits. There is evidence for possession in most human cultures. So, again, I say to people, what mainstream are you talking about? I think I'm in the mainstream. You may not be.
In addition to the book itself, is there any other place where our listeners can follow your work and career? Website, social media, anything along those lines?
People can Google me, and there are different podcasts and other forums where I've spoken out about this issue. I think perhaps the thing that will get more publicity than anything else, and I'm not a materialistic person. I'm not doing any of this to enrich myself or anything, but Hollywood has decided to make a movie out of the story of the woman that I call the Satanic Queen. So I think that'll create a certain buzz because it's being done as a feature film by a major studio.
Yeah, after reading that chapter, I'm definitely looking forward to seeing that. Before ending the episode, I would like to make a few observations. There is no doubting Dr. Gallagher's experience and expertise in this area, nor his attempt to carefully document these unsettling cases of demonic oppression and possession. And we appreciate him taking the time to speak with us. When we combine his thoughts with that of our other recent guest on this general topic, hospital chaplain Dr. Paul Blair, we find two very serious people that through their own direct experiences have come to completely believe in demonic attacks and the need for exorcisms to stop them. Much of what they have to say and report is extremely compelling and worthy of further thought. Where I have some difficulty squaring their perspective with my own is the danger of trying to investigate the paranormal, and that ghosts tend to be deceiving demons. In my 20 years of working for the Haunted Walk and constantly researching all sorts of matters surrounding the supernatural, including creating unique adventures and paranormal investigations, I find my experience and viewpoint to be quite different. In fact, rather the opposite. While sometimes we do have scary things that happen at our events, the most profound experiences that our guests tend to have are positive in nature. A reassurance that there is something beyond this mortal life, and that while we are yet to understand much that falls within the category of the paranormal, there's something uplifting, exciting, and fulfilling in wrestling with this great mystery. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. And thanks again to Dr. Richard Gallagher for the generosity of his time and his insights. For more information about our ghost tours and paranormal adventures, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. And don't forget to use that promo code HauntedTalks to get 15% off all your ghost tour tickets this March break. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk. And please be sure to follow, rate, and review the show wherever you listen to us. We always love reading those 5-star reviews. Special thanks to our entire Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.